Hi, we start in today on Luke's orderly account of the story of Jesus. And if you haven't watched the introductory session, episode 1 of this series, I'd encourage you to do that unless you're already familiar with the cultural context and the style of Luke, where I provided a number of things that help orient us. But if you've already watched that or you feel comfortable jumping in, here we go, right into verse 1, chapter 1. So Luke begins with a prologue. The narrator, we can assume that's the author, but we can't really know that. So the I speaking here, we have to attribute to being a narrator. It may be the voice of the actual author, and that may be a reasonable assumption, but we can't know that. The narrator, in a literary sense, is a character in the story, and the author is outside the story. So since we don't even know who the name of this person is, despite Luke right here, as I said last time, none of the Gospels come with authorship. So there's just this anonymous I speaking. And that's those first 4 verses here. So most scholars think of this as a prologue because, as we can see in verse 5, the narrative actually starts with the events around the setting up the time of Jesus and the time of King Herod, and this is separate from this first-person voice. So a couple things that we need to look at here. First about prologues and then about the language. So prologues were not unusual in Greek literature, especially those written to the elite. Here's an example of it from sort of the Bible. This is from the book of Sirach or Ecclesiasticus. I say it's sort of from the Bible because it's written in Greek, but it's not part of the New Testament. So that makes it part of the Apocrypha or the added-on books that are in some collections and not in others. So in this case, it's in the Revised Standard, as you can see the RSV here. But the New Revised Standard doesn't have it in that. And similarly, Protestant Bibles often don't have these books, and Catholic Bibles have them interspersed in between. So if you don't know what Sirach is, that's a little of what it is. It's written by an anonymous. Ben Sirach is the name, but that's probably more of a title than anything else. In probably around 175, roughly the same time period as the book of Daniel and just a little before the book of Maccabees, when the Greek culture was having a great influence on the people in Jerusalem. So it isn't surprising that Luke, writing in a Greek cultural context, takes his tradition from an element that was common in the Greek cultural context. So you can see similarly here that the author of Sirach starts with very similar ideas as what Luke's starting with here. So let's take a quick look. Whereas many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophets and the others that followed them, an account of which we should praise Israel for instruction and wisdom, and since it is necessary not only that the readers themselves should acquire understanding, but also those who love learning should be able to help the outsiders by both speaking and writing, my grandfather Jesus, of course not the same Jesus, after devoting himself especially to the reading of the law and the prophets and the other books of our fathers, and after acquiring considerable proficiency in them, was himself also led to write something pertaining to instruction and wisdom, in order that by becoming conversant with this also, those who love learning should make even greater progress in living according to the law. Period. Phew! All one sentence in English and in the Greek, as is Luke's all one sentence. And even the New Revised Standard here highlights with commas. So part of the tradition is one big long sentence establishing the precedents. So many great teachings in here since many others. And what the context of what's being said is, and who it's being said to and why, for the instruction and wisdom of others here. And here's that you may know the truth. So following pretty much in a tradition there of that time. And there were many other similar kinds of prologues. So that gives us some context for why Luke's doing this. And it also is one of the big clues right away about Luke's audience. So different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In the introductory episode, I highlighted that one of Luke's differences is he uses a lot of big words, complicated words and sophisticated words in great contrast to others. And to see that, let's look just at the interlinear of John and of Luke side by side. I know this is a little bit awkward, and if you can't read the Greek, I realize it's impossible. But what you can at least see is the length of the words. So here's Luke's prologue, and you can see all these long words here. Look at that in contrast with John's prologue here. So, en arche en halagas kai halagas in proston theon. Notice not one word longer than 5 letters. Down here, egeneto is 7 letters, but you see it's all pretty much little words, 2, 3 letter, 4 letter words, whereas Luke has all these very long, complex words. And as we'll see when we get into the paying attention to the details, which we'll do in a moment, not only are they long words, but they're unusual words. They're unusual words biblically, and they're unusual words in the Greek language in general. Fortunately, we have resources now where we can not only search for where a Greek word is used biblically, as Reverend Dr. Strong helped us do back in the late 19th century, but nowadays we can search for all of extant Greek literature to see where words are used, and sometimes we'll do that, and it'll be very helpful to find words that are rare in the New Testament, but were used in a particular context in the other parts of the Greek world. So, and Luke uses a lot of those words, as we'll see. So that's just a couple of things about form and style. Let's listen to what he has to say. So he starts off this way. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us. So, undertaken to set down an orderly account. Let's look at the Greek first before we try to explore a little bit of what he might be saying there. So the word for since here, epideper, as you can see here, inasmuch, only here in the Greek Bible. As Marshall, a major commentator, notes, Luke is not so much concerned with Luke's motivation for writing as his justification. So in other words, since other people have already written, why should you write again? Why do we need one more story of Jesus? And that's what he's going to explain in just a moment. So since many have undertaken here, epikaresin, this is not as unusual a word to put their hands on, kare from hands, and a lot of words about are related to that, like tradition is to hand on, so we'll see a lot of hand-related words used euphemistically in Greek. It's used a couple of times here in Acts, and 12 times in the Septuagint, not as common, not a unique word, but obviously still not very common when it's only 15 times in the entire Bible. So since many have undertaken or put their hands on the task of setting down an orderly account, and you can see that here, orderly narration, diegesis here, and you can see both those words. Diegesis only here in the New Testament. In Aristotle's rhetoric, it's used as a statement of the case one is seeking to argue. So it's not the narration in the sense of the story itself. It's what you're going to show and why people should believe that what you're showing is worth paying attention to. And taking a step back to orderly here, the word means to compile or organize a report. So he's using some technical language here to position himself as someone who's professionally trained, or at least professionally capable of sifting through evidence and arranging the reports in ways that will be edifying for the audience. So if not as a wealthy person, at least as a highly educated person, which would in itself make him amongst the handful of the elite. So orderly account of the events, or a pragmaton, from which we get pragmatic here. The things, you can see that right here, the things that have happened. And although fulfilled is a very common idea in the Bible, the word he uses is again a very rare one, from the root plerophoria, only here in the Gospels and Acts, and 6 times in the New Testament, meaning brought to fruition, based on Philo, the Jewish philosopher in Alexandria, who's contemporaneous with the early writers, especially with Paul. In rabbinic traditions interpreting the Septuagint, references to God filling things with earth elements. There are a number of fulfillments in Luke, and we'll see how that plays out later, but using other words. So he's using a very unusual word for fulfillment here. So you notice already just in the first verse, we have 4 words that are, if not unique here, that are very rare. So he's starting off signaling very strongly, I'm smart and I have a big vocabulary, and so if you do too, I'm not speaking down to you, I'm going to speak at your level. That might have been very important in the Roman world, where people might have dismissed messages of Jesus by the late 1st century as taken up only by foolish people and uneducated people, and that would include women and other excluded people who were in the stereotypes of the time and not capable of thinking clearly and rationally and coming to reasoned judgments. So Luke's trying to say at the beginning, look, I'm like you, I'm someone who's intelligent and thoughtful, and so don't dismiss me right away as just women's talk, which will be part of the ironic end, where the women will come back and witness to the empty tomb and the men will not believe it. And of course the women are right. So just as they were handed on to us, and this is the tradition word, paradidomai, handed down as tradition. It's also the word for handing over, like Judas handing Jesus over. So whether it's handing something on in a positive sense, like a tradition, the way Paul uses it in 1 Corinthians 11, where he talks about what was handed on to him, about the Last Supper he handed on to the folks who became part of the Corinthian ecclesia, the church in Corinth. So already he's taking a tradition that was given to him at some non-specific time in the past and rearranging it as handed us. And where did he get it from? From the beginning, those who are eyewitnesses and servants of the word. If you looked at all in our series 2 on Revelation, and you can always go back and do that, you'll note a similar issue there where John of Patmos is trying to express where he got his story from, and he claims he got it from God, who gave it to Jesus, who gave it to an angel, etc. Here it's coming from those who are from the beginning eyewitnesses. And the phrase from the beginning, hoi ap arches here, as Joel Gray notes, not a chronological reference, but an imprecise carrier of a value-laden idea, affirming the age of the tradition. Which is to say that for a Roman audience who would be very suspicious of new things, Luke is trying to establish this isn't brand new, at least, although he won't go as far as 2nd and 3rd century Christian writers were as to say that the quote-unquote Christian message is really the ancient Jewish message, and the Jews didn't understand it, and so it was taken away from them. Luke doesn't have to go nearly that far. But in Acts of the Apostles, we'll see where he does border on Christian supersessionism, but that's down the road. So, just as they were handed on to us from those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses, and the word for eyewitness, is the one that may be surprising in English for many people. It's the word from which you get autopsy, which isn't what you think of as an eyewitness, but, the taking apart of a dead body to determine what's wrong with it. But here it is, autopsy. But that's what it's from. So, opt, like I, and auto, so eyewitness. Something automatically. It's not the same as martyria, which is the word for witness, or martus, for individual witness. There'll be some of that too, so a different word here for that. This is more in the sense of examining something to determine its validity as opposed to testifying. So more like an investigator, a close-up investigator. And servants, in this case, huperetai, not the word from which we get deacons. You can see it up there in the Greek. That's often the common word translated servants, and sometimes the Greek doulos, which literally means slaves, is translated servants, really just to soften the sound of slaves. This is a different word. Huperetai is often used in John's Gospel and literally means underlings. People who work underneath somebody else's authority. So, in this case, servants of the word, not of a king or some other human, but servants of the word. So, underlings to the word and eyewitnesses. So, that's the source of his authority, is people who are eyewitnesses and servants from the beginning who handed on to us. I think we can assume that this us is a rhetorical us, and there's not actually multiple people, since he says I here. But it's hard to know. In Acts, Luke will speak, presumably it's Luke in a first-person narration of being present during Paul's time. So many scholars have assumed that Luke, or the author, if he's not Luke, was there with Paul, but that could also be a rhetorical device. And when we get to Acts, we'll see how that was actually a common rhetorical device to insert a first-person narrator into adventure stories to make them more exciting. We can't take everything at face value, and we won't, and we'll let you as listeners to these recordings decide for yourself. So he says, I too decided here, or chose, or was disposed to a number of times. As we saw last time, it's a key theme in Luke Acts, to make a choice. That this good news is presented out there, and people need to make a choice. So the author too made a choice, but only after this, after investigating everything carefully from the very first. So literally having followed closely, and as Vincent notes, ancient writers of history often use this word to mean investigated or informing oneself. So that's now the second word he's using here to highlight that he's not just taking these reports as credible, but and not just ordering them. He's not just arranging things, but thinking them through and investigating and testing their validity for himself. So he's doing everything he can to establish the validity of the following narrative right from the start for readers who could well be suspicious, and understandably so. Everything carefully, akribos here, in the Greek word order, I have the note here. Let's see, you can see it here. Here's here's akribos. You see the word order is a little different here than it would be in the English, if you look at that closely. So investigate everything carefully from the first. In the Greek, from the first comes before the carefully. Or to write from the very first. The word here is anothen, which is a surprising use of this. Anothen is the common word in John 3 for born again or born from above. In this case, the again is one way we could hear that he's investigated everything carefully again, like it's already been investigated by others, but he's doing it again, just like many others have written, and he's undertaking to write again. It says orderly account again in the new RSV, but it's not the same words as up here in verse 1. So here, cathexis, which has to do more with orderliness, and here there's no word for account. So what he's highlighting here is that he's not only investigated, but he's putting things in a proper sequence. And anybody who's actually studied not history itself, but the theory of history, of how history is written and what history writing is well aware that the order in which you narrate things has a big effect on the reader. If you have flashbacks or flash forwards, that shapes what people know at a given point in the flow. If you narrate things in a strict chronological order, then things just unfold the way they often do in life. But also in life, we remember things and we anticipate things in the future. So even though we live necessarily in the present that's unfolding from the past to the future, but we actually do live in the past and the future because that's where our mind is often occupied. So writers can do the same thing, can write retrospectively or prospectively. And he doesn't say that he's going to put it in strict chronological order, but in a sequence that makes sense to him. And he's writing it to most excellent Theophilus. Theophilus means friend of God, and scholars argue unfruitfully, I think, about is this a real person named Theophilus who is perhaps a patron, which could make sense that somebody's paying him to write this, and he's now expressing gratitude to his patron for giving him the leisure time to do the research and writing necessary here. But the very nature of the name as friend of God suggests that it's like dear reader. He's writing to anybody, assuming that anybody who would want to read this account is a friend of God. So we don't have to decide whether it's written to a real person or to an imaginary audience. But the Theophilus certainly puts it in that Greek context here. And as does the term for most excellent here, Christiste, which is a form of polite address. And it suggests that the audience would resonate with something being directed to somebody who's important, rather than just to ordinary people down on the ground, that they could say that's people like us. And finally, and the reason for this is so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So know here, or recognize, epignosis, which is to know again. So several things we've seen about repetition, other undertakings, other investigations, and so perhaps to reinforce, we might say, the truth, since they've already been instructed. So recognize in this case could be to reinforce or to secure your faith, involve with asphalia. Not truth here, which is aletheia in Greek. Asphalia is with security or certainty, and a key reference here to keep in mind is 1 Thessalonians 5:3, where Paul uses it to quote the Roman slogan Pax et Securitas, and he says here to the church in Thessalonica, when they, which is say the Romans, say there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them. And in other words, the Roman peace and security is being challenged and will be revealed to be false by God's peace and security, the Pax Christi in this case. But any Roman audience hearing that what Luke's goal here is to provide security for them in this narrative is to offer an alternative form of security to the Roman Pax Romana. So it's a little subversive thing there that tells us from the beginning that this is going to challenge the Roman Empire. Notice in this prologue, nothing about Jesus, nothing about God, nothing at all that would suggest that this is what we think of as a religious text or scripture or anything like that. This could all be taken as from to any kind of text that could follow this. And even once we get to the days of King Herod, we don't know there's anything otherwise until we get to priests and priestly order and righteous before God. So once we get into the narrative proper, it'll become a familiar zone of conversation that sounds biblical to us. But these first 4 verses would allow a reader who's not predisposed to be reading Jewish texts or scriptural texts or texts about Jesus to perhaps feel that this text was meant to include people like them. So if that's people like you who aren't sure about God and aren't sure about Jesus but are looking for an intelligent, thoughtful way to approach this, I hope you enjoyed this series, and I hope you can decide for yourselves whether the way of Jesus presented here is good news for us today. All right, take care. See you next time. Bye-bye.